Welcome back to Bark Bites Comics. I'm your host, Jasper Bark, and this is the third and final show in our series on the legendary horror comics character Swamp Thing. We're going to be taking a look at the creative teams that made a significant contribution to the Swamp Thing mythos. But before we do, I would consider it a personal favour if you'd go below, find that like button and that subscribe button and hit them like they were a headshot on a brain-hungry zombie. Thanks in advance for that. And now, on to Rick Veitch. Could Rick Veitch follow Alan Moore on Swamp Thing? Well, to be honest with you, not a lot of people thought he could. In fact, most people expected him to be nowhere near as good as Alan Moore. And this lack of expectation, I believe, gave Veitch a certain license on this title. Because when no one expects anything of you, that's when you can catch them all unawares. And I believe that's what Veitch did with his run on Swamp Thing. It was better than anyone expected it would be. Up until this point, the main strength of the creative teams that had done really well on Swamp Thing had been their collaboration. The fact that the finished piece was greater than the sum of the parts of any individual contribution. Veitch's run was the first time we had a single artist's vision on the series, although it is worthwhile recognising the contributions of inker Alfred Alcala and colourist Titania Wood, whose run on Swamp Thing was longer than any other single creative team or individual. As Rick Veitch's storyline begins, the Parliament of Trees are concerned that they've lost the champion of the green, as Swamp Thing spent many months exiled away in space. This left a vacuum that they had to fill, so they set in motion a series of events that would create another Swamp Thing. Unfortunately, when Swamp Thing came back, this overturned all of their careful plans. Unfortunately, they had created an ethereal being, a sort of essence of the green, known as the Sprout, and the Sprout was looking for a new Swamp Thing body to inhabit. This created a huge dilemma for Swamp Thing, because Swamp Thing realised that if he didn't stop the Sprout would go on trying to create new bodies for itself, and this would upset the subtle balance of the green. But the only way to stop the Sprout was to kill it, which was something that Swamp Thing was reluctant to do. Then, his partner Abigail Arcane came to his aid and suggested that Swamp Thing, because he couldn't find a solution, grow a bigger brain in order to deal with this knotty problem and cut through the Gordian knot of his dilemma. This is another of the ways in which Rick Veitch took the themes and ideas that were introduced by Alan Moore over the course of his run and took them to a whole new level. Alan, John and Steve had introduced the concept of mind-expanding substances. Rick Veitch went one step further by quite literally expanding Swamp Thing's mind and, in the process, expanding his consciousness. This, for me, is one of my favourite issues in the whole of Rick Veitch's run. In fact, it's probably one of my favourite issues in the whole of Swamp Thing, because I found Rick Veitch's portrayal of Swamp Thing growing his brain and growing his mind to be quite literally psychotropic. I could feel my consciousness expanding along with Swamp Thing's, and it was an exhilarating experience. Anyway, the solution that Swamp Thing hits upon in his newly enlightened phase is that the future of Avatars of the Green will be an animal-vegetable hybrid. And he means to go about this by using John Constantine, by possessing John Constantine in order to impregnate Abby with Swamp Thing and Abby's child to create a vessel for the Sprout. And so the character of Tefe, Abby's and Swamp Thing's child, is born. The use of John Constantine in the storyline was another of the ways that Veitch picked up on the ideas that Moore introduced to the series and again ran with them. Up until this point, Moore's treatment of Constantine, a character that was so popular with readers, he'd just been given his own book in the title Hellblazer, written by Moore's protege Jamie Delano. The way that Moore had portrayed this character up to this point had been as a man of mystery, somebody who's always one step ahead of all the other characters, who steps out of the shadows with the answer to their problem at just the right moment. Veitch took this element of Constantine's character and again expanded upon it, looking at the ways in which Constantine operates and how he hits upon all these solutions and how he stays one step ahead of all the other characters. And he managed to do this without ever taking away any of the mystery behind the character or any of its mystique. And in fact, his portrayal of Constantine is an early high point for the character. Unfortunately, after the crossover between the new Hellblazer title and Swamp Thing under Veitch's run, things started to go badly wrong for Rick Veitch. How did it all go wrong for Rick Veitch? Well, it all began with Invasion, which was a crossover event that ran across all of DC's titles in 1988-89. At this point, Rick Veitch had actually given up the art chores on Swamp Thing and was simply writing it. The effect that Invasion had on Swamp Thing was to exile him from his own time stream and send him travelling backwards in time through the Green. The concept of using the Green to travel through time was another idea that Alan Moore had introduced into the series but not really done anything with. So Rick picked this up and ran with it. In this storyline, Swamp Thing travels further and further back in time, meeting historical characters from the DC universe, like Jonah Hex and the Shining Knight. Unfortunately, this all came to a crashing halt with what should have been issue 88 of Veitch's run. In this issue, Veitch had suggested a story in which Swamp Thing actually meets Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. In order to do a story like this, he had to get the agreement of the upper echelons of DC's management. So he showed the script and all of his story ideas not only to his editor Karen Berger, but also to the publisher Jeanette Kahn. As the story was being drawn by Michael Zulli, Rick Veitch drew a cover showing, for issue 88, showing Swamp Thing as the cross on which Christ is crucified. Not actually Christ on the cross, just the cross itself with the face of Swamp Thing on the top of it. This cover was seen by certain DC employees who considered themselves to be very devout Christians, and they went to Jeanette Kahn with their objections. Round about this time, the filmmaker Martin Scorsese had run into a lot of trouble with his film, The Last Temptation of Christ, which had caused a furore amongst evangelical Christians because of its depiction of Christ's temptation while he's on the cross being crucified. Because of the negative backlash that this film created, Jeanette Kahn panicked and completely nixed the whole story. With only 3 days to go, Karen Berger phoned up Rick Veitch and told him he'd have to come up with a whole new idea for the book. Veitch was very concerned about this. He didn't feel he'd done anything wrong, and he tried everything he possibly could to save the story, promising to make any changes that they wanted. However, both Kahn and Berger had made up their minds and they were not going to allow this story to go ahead. And in fact, Veitch has said they made him feel like he was completely at fault and he'd done something utterly terrible and ruined the book and brought the name of DC into disrepute. So with a very heavy heart, he resigned from the book, and his last issue was issue 87. He was supposed to continue the storyline and then hand over the book to the writer Neil Gaiman, who at that point, Gaiman's star was rising very much at DC because of his success on the book Sandman. This is years and years and years before Gaiman was completely disgraced for his unacceptable behaviour. Gaiman and Veitch had apparently worked out an ending to the story that both writers thought was absolutely fabulous, and Gaiman was supposed to take over the writing chores once this storyline had finished. At that point, Gaiman was seen as something of an heir apparent to Alan Moore's crown at DC. This was due in no small part to the fact that he had been hand-chosen by Moore to take over the writing of one of Moore's flagship titles, that of Miracle Man. So it seemed at the time like he was the perfect person to use to continue writing Swamp Thing. He was also to have been joined in the writing of Swamp Thing by Jamie Delano, another of Moore's protégés, who at that point, as we've already said, was writing Hellblazer. Unfortunately, because of the circumstances under which Rick Veitch left the book, neither Gaiman nor Delano felt that they could in all good conscience carry on writing it, so they also resigned, leaving Karen Berger to scrabble about for a writer to continue the series. She eventually hit upon Doug Wheeler, but actually nobody has anything particularly excited or praiseworthy to say about his run on the title. Wheeler was eventually replaced by the horror writer Nancy Collins, whose most famous character is the vampire detective Sonia Blue. Collins returned the book to its roots and also set about creating something of a domestic drama, focusing on the relationship between Abby and Swamp Thing and their newborn daughter Tefe, as well as concentrating on that very domestic setup. Collins also reintroduced Anton Arcane as the villain of the piece and brought back the Sunderland Corporation. She also created a character called Lady Jane to be a nanny to Tefe, and as nannies sometimes do, Lady Jane ends up having an affair behind Abigail's back with Swamp Thing. This eventually brings about the end of Abigail and Swamp Thing's relationship, and Abigail leaves both her daughter and Swamp Thing for another man. So at the end of her run, Nancy Collins undoes the whole status quo that she'd restored at the beginning of it. However, this was nothing compared to the seismic changes that the next creative team were about to bring to this book. And who would that creative team be? That would be writer Grant Morrison, his then protege Mark Millar, artist Philip Hester, and inker Kim de Mulder. At the time that Morrison took over the book, this would be 1994, and with issue 140, the well-publicised rivalry between Grant Morrison and Alan Moore was coming to a head. So for Morrison to take over the book that had made Moore famous probably seemed like a bit of a coup. However, Grant Morrison would only stay on the book for 4 titles before he left because, as he claimed later in interview, DC wouldn't allow him to turn Swamp Thing into a Dadaist manifesto. However, the 4 issues that he did write in conjunction with Mark Millar are something of a high point for the book. They are creepy as hell, and they were so controversial at the time that the DC offices received a record amount of mail. In the storyline, the Parliament of Trees have become so tired of Swamp Thing constantly defying them that they split his human-like consciousness apart from his vegetable body, effectively creating 2 independent selves. The human-like self thinks it is Alec Holland once again, only this time Alec Holland believes himself to be an ethnobotanist living in the Amazonian rainforests in Peru, studying the psychedelic substances used by the local shamans. while he's taking these psychedelic substances, he has a series of hallucinations wherein he believes at one point he was actually an earth elemental. However, he keeps having flashbacks where he realizes that the vegetable body that was this earth elemental is now rampaging murderously through the swamps in Louisiana. And he realizes he has to make his way back to Louisiana to reunite with the Swamp Thing. And the only way he can do this is through a spectral means of transport known as the Soul Train. And he's guided in this endeavour by three shady characters known as the Fates. Inevitably, Alec Holland does reunite with the Swamp Thing and stop its murderous spree, but this is only the first in a series of trials that Swamp Thing will have to undergo. At this point, Grant Morrison bows out and Mark Millar takes over the full writing chores. Millar at this point was only 24 years old, and in fact his collaborator Philip Hester, the artist, was only 2 years older at 26. Unfortunately, in later years in interviews, Hester has said that he wishes he could go back and fix his art on Swamp Thing, or at least redraw some of it, because he believes he's become a much better artist. I think he's being a little bit too hard on himself, because I love his work on this series. His strange angular depiction of characters and his ultra scratchy lines, embellished and elevated by Kim de Mulder, who as an inker has made probably the single most significant contribution to this run on Swamp Thing since John Tottleman, are absolutely perfect for the horrific and terrifying story that Millar was telling. Millar's storyline concerns itself with the question of, if there is a parliament of trees, are there any other elemental parliaments operating on Earth? As it turns out, there are. There is the Parliament of Stones, the Parliament of Waves, the Parliament of Vapours, and the Parliament of Flames. And Swamp Thing finds himself in a series of predicaments where he has to come face to face with the champion of these specific and individual elemental parliaments in a death match, which will see him either die or take on the powers and responsibilities of each one of those individual parliaments. In each of these trials, he is guided by the three fates. But as it turns out, these fates have a sinister agenda. They want Swamp Thing to take over all the different parliaments to become the individual avatar of the Earth itself, so that Swamp Thing can destroy all life on Earth and begin over, and in order to save the planet. This apocalyptic quest comes to a head with issue 71, and the way that Millar resolves this storyline is, quite frankly, absolutely brilliant and totally unexpected, and it ties up a run that changed Swamp Thing almost as much as Alan Moore's absolutely groundbreaking run did. I won't tell you how he resolves it, because that would spoil it for you, and I hope you will go and search out the trades. Although I will say that Swamp Thing doesn't bring about the end of the world. Unfortunately though, this last issue, issue 171, did bring about the end of this run for Swamp Thing. Was that the end for Swamp Thing? Well, no. There would actually be 5 more series following this. In 2000, Vertigo relaunched Swamp Thing under the auspices of writer Brian K. Vaughan, who is probably best known for writing Saga and Y the Last Man. Beginning in 2000, Brian wrote a series that concentrated not on Swamp Thing, but on Swamp Thing and Abby's daughter, Tefe, in a 20-part series that was extremely well received. Then in 2004, Vertigo relaunched the book once again, this time written by Andy Diggle, Will Pfeiffer and Joshua Dysart, and that series lasted for another 29 issues. However, It is the creative team on the 5th series that I'd like to take a closer look at, because they, once again, rebooted the entire Swamp Thing universe. Who would have the balls to reboot Swamp Thing? Well, that would be the creative team of writer Scott Snyder and artist Yannick Paquette. Scott Snyder had become best known at this point, 2011, for writing the horror series American Vampire for Vertigo and for his highly acclaimed run on Batman. Yannick Paquette had drawn Justice League of America for DC Comics and Ultimate X-Men for Marvel. They rebooted Swamp Thing as part of DC's New 52. This was a company-wide initiative that rebooted every single character in the DC universe, wiping out decades of continuity and starting each character in their new #1 issue. In Swamp Thing's case, Alec Holland is brought back to life and approached by an avatar of the green. The Parliament of the Trees need Holland to accept the mantle of the Swamp Thing so he can see off the threat of the rot. Holland is completely unwilling to accede to their demands and turns them down flat, whereupon he is kidnapped by a motorcycle-riding, shotgun-wielding Abigail Arcane, who needs Holland's help and Holland's help alone in helping her save her half-brother, William Arcane, a terminal child cancer patient, from the clutches of the rot that wants to make William Arcane its avatar. The Rot is an innovation created by Snyder and Paquette that's set up to be probably the complete antithesis of the green. Whereas the green's purpose is to encourage all plant life to flourish and grow, the Rot's purpose is to encourage all life on the planet to decay and become corrupted. Ultimately, Alec and Abigail are unable to save William from the hands of the rot, but this does mean that Holland eventually gives in to the Parliament of the Trees and accepts the mantle he was born to bear, that of Swamp Thing. There then follows an epic 18-part storyline that sees Swamp Thing face off against the Rot and all of its champions, which includes your favourite Swamp Thing villain and mine, Mr. Anton Arcane. The whole storyline culminates in Rotworld, which is an epic post-apocalyptic drama that sees a crossover between the new Swamp Thing title and the new Animal Man title, then written by Jeff Lemire. I won't tell you how it all turns out, but like the rest of the run, it is a highly action-packed and also completely terrifying run. As well as introducing a lot more action and a lot more horror into the series, Snyder and Paquette brought about a lot of visual innovations to the Swamp Thing character as well, giving him a huge pair of wooden antlers like a stag and even the ability to fly. I think as well as adding action and horror, Snyder and Paquette probably brought more innovations and more new ideas to the Swamp Thing mythos than any previous creative team since Mark Millar and Philip Hester. And that's why I've chosen them to be the final creative team to take a deep dive into. I am aware that there are many creative teams who've worked on the character of Swamp Thing that have either glossed over in this examination or not mentioned at all. If by any chance I have failed to mention or concentrate on your favourite creative team, I would really like to hear from you. Please do leave a comment below telling me which team you think I ought to have included in these videos, and also your reasons for thinking that they deserve all of our time and attention. In the meantime, I would very strongly recommend you search out the collected editions of all of these runs because they are very much worth your time, trouble and money. Trust your Uncle Jasper on this. You know it makes sense.